Good morning or afternoon or evening or middle of the night, government students, whenever you're watching this. This is Mr. McCrae, and this is your introductory lecture to the legislative branch. And so we covered Unit 1, the foundations of government in the United States, and we covered Unit 2 all the way up to, but not including the test, and you don't have to worry about that Unit 2 test anymore. We're just going to move on from there. So Unit 2 was all about the Constitution and constitutional rights. Now we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty about how government actually functions in the United States. And we're going to start off with the place where those laws are actually written, which is the legislative branch. And so what you should have is you should have been able to make a copy of that Google Doc I put that has the study guide notes, and those study guide notes are just for today, just for this lecture. And then you should be able to make a copy and fill those out as we go here. And again, you can write down exactly what's on the slide, or you can, and I encourage you to, write down your own interpretation of it, whatever you think helps, but you need to make sure that all those questions get answered in a reasonably complete way to get a 2 or a complete grade for that assignment. And once you have that done, you submit it on the Google Classroom as an assignment, and I'll be able to see that you did it and be able to put that grade in there. So now that you know how that works, let's get started here. And so the first thing to know is that when we talk about the legislative branch, in some ways we could talk about the two legislative branches, because there's both a federal legislative branch and there's a state legislative branch, right? The state government is basically a representation of the federal government, or at least it is in Michigan. So in Congress, and we only call Congress the legislatures that are in Washington, D.C., that govern for the whole country. So Congress in Washington, D.C., it represents all the 50 states. There are two houses of Congress. The first house is the Senate. The second house is the House of Representatives. Then we have the Michigan legislature, and of course that meets in Lansing, and it makes laws that just apply to the state and people of Michigan. But it also has two houses, one called the Senate and one called the House of Representatives. And you'll usually hear people, when they're talking about that, they'll say the Michigan Senate, or the Michigan House, or the state senator, from Grand Rapids, or something like that, so that you know whether they're talking about Congress, the national legislature, or they're talking about the Michigan legislature in Lansing. But know that those are different, that they deal with different aspects of government, that the qualifications for office are a little bit different, that they, and so there are important differences, but, there are two of them. We're mostly going to focus today on Congress, on the federal government. You should have learned about the Michigan legislature like when you were in 4th grade, and I'm sure you remember all of that in exacting detail, and that's great. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to take the national look, and we're going to look at Congress. So, like I said, we have two houses of Congress, and here's stuff that you're going to want to know. So we have the Senate. How many members are in the Senate? There are 100 members of the Senate. Why are there 100? Did they just pick that number because it's a nice round number? No. There are 2 senators from each state. There are 50 states. 50 times 2 is 100. Before there were 50 states, there were fewer senators. So when the country was first created, the Constitution was first ratified, we only had 13 states. We had 26 senators. In 1955, when we only had 48 states, there were only 96 senators. So, this has grown throughout history as we've added states in a pretty regular way. Currently, the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party. There are 53 Republicans, and there are 45 Democrats. There's also, those numbers don't quite up to 100. There are 2 independents in the Senate, but both are pretty liberal. One you've probably heard of. One is Bernie Sanders. You might think, wait, I thought Bernie Sanders was a Democrat. Wasn't he just running as a Democrat for president? Yes, he was. But when he's run for his Senate seat from his home state of Vermont, he has never run as a Democrat. He has run as an independent. And the other independent is also from the Northeast. Angus King, the senator from Maine, is the other independent. But they're both pretty liberal, so you can kind of think of them as being Democrats in everything but name. The House of Representatives is 435 members. The history of that number is kind of complex. Originally in the Constitution, you might recall, there was a formula that they had developed, and then they kind of assigned an initial number. Then the House grew throughout time, but then in the early 20th century, they're just like, okay, it's big enough. The number is 435. And remember that 435 is divided by state's population. So you take the population of the whole country and you divide it by 435, and you come out with about how many people should be in each congressional seat. It does vary a little bit because no state can have less than one. Some states do only have one. Very small states like Wyoming has one member of the House of Representatives. They actually have more senators. There's 2 senators from Wyoming, like there are from every state. And then they have members of the House of Representatives. But because they're so small, they have to have one. The number of people represented by that one person for the House of Representatives in Wyoming is actually smaller than it is in some of the larger states, like California or Texas or New York. So that it doesn't work out perfectly, but it's pretty close to the same number. And so as we, every 10 years we do the census. You've probably, we're doing a census right now because it's 2020. And the results of those census actually change how many Congress people each state gets. So right now Michigan has 14, but some people have speculated that number might fall to 13 after the census because Michigan's population has not risen as quickly as other states, so it's a smaller proportional percentage of the country's population. Therefore, that number of Michigan people in Congress may decline. It might be a smaller percentage of the 435 you see. Right now, the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democratic Party. There are 232 Democrats. There are 196 Republicans. There's exactly 1 independent in the House of Representatives. I'll tell you more about him in a second. And there are 6 vacancies. You'll remember from when we read about the Constitution that if there's vacancies in the Senate, that they can be immediately filled by the governor of their state. And so if a Michigan senator, a Michigan U.S. senator died, then Gretchen Whitmer could go and name anybody she wanted that had the qualifications of a senator and said, hey, you are now a senator from Michigan. Go to work. So vacancies in the Senate don't happen nearly as often. Vacancies in the House, though, must be filled by election. You can have elections kind of in there, what we call special elections, and so usually a vacancy happens because a member of Congress either dies or because they resign. Sometimes, of course, they resign in scandal or some other, unfortunate thing happens. Sometimes they get sick and they feel like they can't serve anymore, but, they leave. They're either dead or they're resigned. And so then no one is serving in the House of Representatives from that seat. And no one will serve until a special election can be arranged to fill it. The term of office for people in the House is only 2 years. So that means every other year you have to be reelected if you want to continue to serve in the House of Representatives. Which kind of creates a culture of almost constant campaigning. Because campaign cycles run on basically 2-year schedules, as soon as one campaign is over, and congratulations, Mr. Congressman or Mr. Congresswoman, you've been reelected. The people of your district sent you back to Washington to represent them. You might get like a couple of weeks to kind of savor that, and then, once the, buzz wears off, it's time to start getting out and fundraising and lining up supporters and newspaper endorsements to get ready to run again in 2 years. So, with that in mind, you can understand how the life of these Congress people basically becomes a life of occasional governance and constant campaigning. And so some people have suggested perhaps that term of office should be lengthened, but, since the beginning it's been 2 years. The term of office for senators, on the other hand, is much longer. It's 6 years. It's actually longer than the president's term. And so senators, on the other hand, they have to run for election every 6 years, so they get about 4 years in there where they can kind of focus on governing before they have to worry about running again. The way that we do the Senate is that 1/3 of the Senate is elected every even-numbered year. So it's not like you go 6 years and then they're all up for election, right? It's staggered. 1/3 every 2 years. And no state will have both of its senators running for re-election in the same year. So 2 years ago, I'll get to that. The other thing to keep in mind is that neither house has any term limits. As long as you are alive and eligible, you can continue to run for the House of Representatives ad infinitum. You could have served for 50 years, and you can continue to run for re-election. And this has happened. There have been several people in the House and in the Senate who have served for decades. Two of them, John Dingell and John Conyers, both of them now retired, but both of them were congressmen from Metro Detroit. I think John Dingell retired in 2015. He actually died just a few months ago. But he was first elected to Congress in the mid-1950s, I think 1954 or 1956. And so he served for an extraordinary long time, 50 years plus in Congress. John Conyers, I think, was elected in the early 1960s and again served until, I think, until 2019. So again, these people can be in there for a really long time. And again, some people have said, well, maybe we need some term limits to kind of get some new buzz in there, some new life to more people. But so far, the consensus of people in Congress has been that they really like not having any term limits, and so no term limits have ever been imposed. That's unlike the presidency, right, where you get 2 terms now. Since the 1950s, that's been the case. There are certain things that are special about each house. They're not just kind of carbon copies of each other with different numbers of people. The houses, because they have different numbers of people and because of the different things that the Constitution says they're supposed to do, they have different privileges. One thing that is special to the House is that only the House can introduce bills that raise revenue or taxes. This actually goes back to Great Britain and the rule that only the House of Commons could vote for tax increases. The House of Lords could not, because the Commons, the common people, were going to pay most of those taxes. They should get the say on whether they go up or not the aristocracy. And the same rule has been applied to our U.S. Congress, that because the House represents the people, and the people are going to pay the taxes, that the House should be the one to introduce those bills. The House is also the only body that can impeach the president. As we've seen, with the impeachment process for President Trump, this is a 2-step process. The first process, impeachment, happens in the House. The second step is the removal from office, which happens in the Senate. Well, the House has to start the process. The Senate can't just wake up one day and say, well, we want to remove the president and vote. The House has to start it. And so that process, the beginning of the process, impeachment, only happens in the House. House members, generally speaking, enjoy fewer what are called floor privileges. So a floor privilege is basically stuff that you can do when you're speaking in the House or the Senate, or what we call you hold the floor. Basically, everyone's supposed to be paying attention to you. And you can understand why that is, because with 435 people, we don't want people just doing whatever they want. We've got to move things along. So there tends to be stricter rules. People in Congress have less independence. They have time limits on how long they can speak. And so all that kind of allows the leadership of the House of Representatives, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it allows the leadership to kind of keep a control on things and move business forward. And therefore, it tends to be that the House tends to be able to move forward with business more quickly than the Senate does. They keep them kind of on a shorter leash, as it were. The Senate, what special privileges does the Senate get? Well, the big one is that the Senate gets to confirm presidential appointments to the federal courts, the cabinet, and to independent agencies. And so we know that, like, for example, the Supreme Court, the president gets to nominate who's going to go on the Supreme Court when there's a vacancy. But the president just doesn't get to say anybody and put them on there. The Senate has to say, basically thumbs up or thumbs down. We like that person or we don't like that person. And there have been times when they haven't. Famously, Ronald Reagan nominated this guy, Robert Bork, back in the 1980s. And Robert Bork was very conservative. And ultimately, the Senate just felt like he was a little too conservative. And they decided not to confirm his appointment. There have been a few other cases, at the end of President Obama's term, after Antonin Scalia died, he nominated this guy named Merrick Garland. And rather than vote up or down, the Senate basically didn't vote at all. And they basically told Obama that they didn't think that he should be able to nominate someone so late in his term. And so they just sat on the nomination. And then that nomination died when President Trump took over. And then he nominated someone else to serve that seat, Neil Gorsuch, it ended up being. And so the Senate holds the cards for these appointments. And so again, the Supreme Court, but also all other federal courts, members of the cabinet, so like the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, all the way down to, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and, all those big government agencies are all Senate confirmable, so the Senate has to say yes or no. And also independent agencies, so things that are basically things that are considered to be kind of outside or above politics, but the government still kind of regulates. We'll talk more about those later in this unit, actually, but a good example is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, if you remember from economics, controls the monetary policy of the United States. The Federal Reserve is governed by a board of governors. Those governors are appointed by the president, but they're confirmed by the Senate. Also, senators have to ratify any treaties, so the president can negotiate a treaty with another country, but then the Senate has to say yes or no to that treaty. And again, they don't always say yes. Famously, Woodrow Wilson was at the Versailles Treaty, right, that concluded World War I. He negotiated that. He brought it back to the United States, said, hey, we've negotiated a treaty to the end of the war. He put it in front of the Senate, and the Senate said no. And so the United States had to negotiate separate peace treaties then with all the countries in World War I because they did not end up signing on to the Versailles Treaty, the big one. Because there are fewer senators, the senators generally have more floor privileges. The big one is that they have unlimited time for debate. So as a U.S. senator, if you get up and start talking about something, you do not have to stop. No one can make you stop. You can, there are certain rules. You cannot take a drink, which I can tell you myself is a hard thing, because as I've been delivering this lecture for the past 15 minutes or so, I've already had several drinks. And you can't go to the bathroom. But you can continue to talk as long as you're able to stand and read or talk. You can't, and there's all kinds of weird arcane rules. You can't lean on things. You have to stand up straight while you're delivering your speech. But all this put together has led to this kind of weird practice called the filibuster. And the filibuster is where a senator basically will not like something that's happening. Usually there's a bill that they really don't like. And so they will, but they also know that they're going to lose. That when they vote, and they vote no on this bill, that they already know that more people are going to vote yes. And so their position is kind of hopeless. And therefore, what they try to do to stop the bill, and this is almost never successful, but what they will try to do is they will basically try to keep talking to stop people from voting. And you might say, well, why don't they just wait for them to stop and, then they can vote. And in fact, that's usually what they do. But you'd be underestimating the endurance of some of these people if you thought it was just going to be 2 or 3 hours. Famously, and kind of tragically, the greatest filibuster in history was delivered by Senator Strom Thurmond, actually in opposition to a civil rights bill. He was a segregationist, a racist by any other name, and he did not want the Senate to adopt this civil rights bill. And he went to the Senate floor and he started talking for more than 24 hours. 24 hours straight without going to the bathroom, without taking a drink, without leaning on anything, and never stopping talking. You can't stop talking either. You can talk about anything you want. So people delivering filibusters have brought out cookbooks and phone books, and literally they just started reading people's names and phone numbers out of the phone book in order to keep talking so that they don't lose their floor time. So this is kind of an interesting practice and something to look into, and it's always kind of been one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so ridiculous. But it is something that, as a senator, you have the right to do because you have this unlimited floor time. There's kind of this dichotomy in how we think about what each house represents. Because the Senate has equal representation between the states, 2 senators for each states, and originally the senators were elected by the state legislatures. Now we elect senators popularly. You get to vote for your U.S. senator, but that was not always the case. And so for these reasons, we think of the Senate as kind of being the association of the states. That this is where the states of the United States are represented, each one having an equal seat in the Senate. On the other hand, the House of Representatives, because it's divided proportionally by population, is considered kind of to represent the people. And when the framers were setting this up, this was kind of their idea, that the House would be kind of the quick-moving body, that, people would come to the House and they'd have all these big ideas and they'd pass all these bills, and it would kind of be a kind of radical chamber in some ways, whereas the Senate would, in the framers' mind, be much more conservative, much more kind of relaxed and willing to keep old ideas and old traditions alive because, it was the senior body, there were fewer people, they faced less election pressure, and so that there would just be more kind of debate and thought put into Senate actions, and the Senate would, on the whole, be slower moving. And at least on that count, that's pretty much held up. The Senate historically has moved less quickly to pass things than the House has. All right, just a couple more things for today. I want you to know who some of these people are. So, who is your congressman? Your congressman, you live in Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, and your congressman is Justin Amash. And he is that one independent. I told you there's one independent in the House of Representatives, and it is your congressman, Justin Amash. Justin Amash was elected as a Republican, a pretty conservative Republican at that, but he actually, as stuff started to come out about the Trump-Russia connection and the Ukraine thing that led to Trump's impeachment, Amash actually broke with the Republican Party and came out and said, I think that Trump should be impeached and removed from office. I'm still a conservative guy and have conservative views, but I don't think President Trump should be president anymore. And basically, that was not a position that you could hold in the Republican Party, which was committed to backing Trump all the way. And so Amash actually left the Republican Party. But just because you leave your party doesn't mean you leave Congress. So he then became an independent. He doesn't have a party affiliation, but he is still the congressman from the 3rd Congressional District, and he's running for re-election as an independent. And so Justin Amash will face not only a Democratic challenger, he will also face a Republican challenger. I think if you've been on a 96 heading west anytime, you've seen the Fred Meyer Republican for Congress. Maybe it's not Fred, it's some Meyer, Republican for Congress side. That guy, Meyer, is the Republican running against the former Republican, Amash. in this district. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting fact there. Also, if you know Alec Dahl, I think Justin Amash looks just like him. So that's your congressman. And then there are 2 Michigan U.S. senators, like there are from each state. They're both Democrats, Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters. Debbie Stabenow narrowly won re-election a couple years ago, and Gary Peters is actually up for re-election this year. So that Gary Peters could change as of the beginning of 2021, depending on how the elections go this fall. But for today, these are the 2 people. In both the House and the Senate, there are leaders. There is a leadership group. These leadership groups are elected first by their party, and then, depending on what party has the majority, has more of the people in the House, depends on whether they get the majority jobs, the minority jobs. Basically, you can think of the leadership as first controlling the people of their party in the House. And so they have the ability to assign them to committee, and also, generally speaking, for reasons we'll talk about tomorrow, they really kind of control what happens, especially in the House. These people really have a lot of control over what their members do. And then if you're in the majority, because you have control of the majority of the members, you also basically control what the House of Representatives does. And so since Democrats are in the majority in the House, the Democratic leader becomes the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is the member of the House who is voted by the House as basically their leader. And so that person is Nancy Pelosi. She's a Democrat from California. This is actually her second term as Speaker of the House. She was previously the Speaker from 2007 to 2011. And so basically, the most powerful person in the House of Representatives, and by some estimation, the second most powerful person in an elected office in the United States, is Nancy Pelosi. And, you know, her control over the other leadership positions and then her other Democratic members basically means that if Nancy Pelosi wants to get something done in the House, there's a very good chance that that will happen. She has a few people who assist her. The majority leader, who's basically like the second in command of the majority of the House, is a guy named Steny Hoyer. He's a Democrat from Maryland. And then there's a whip. And this sounds like a weird term, and it really kind of does mean exactly what it sounds like. The job of the whip is to keep the people in their caucus or in their party in line. And so the majority whip, or the Democrats' whip, is Jim Clyburn, a representative from South Carolina. And so Jim Clyburn's job is basically to go to other Democrats and say, hey, you're going to vote the way we want you to, right? You're not going to change your mind on this one. And the whip, along with the majority leader and speaker, have various carrots and sticks that they can deploy to make sure that their members vote the way that they want. On the minority side, they also have a leadership structure, although there is no such thing as a minority speaker. There's just the one Speaker of the House. And so the leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives is the minority leader. Kevin McCarthy is the current minority leader. He's a Republican from California. And then the Republicans also have a minority whip, and that's Steve Scalise, a Republican from Louisiana. Steve Scalise was actually once shot playing a baseball game, but he has subsequently recovered and has gone back to being the minority whip. In the Senate, things are a little bit different. There are more Republicans in the Senate, as you saw, so the Republicans are in the majority. No matter who was in control of the Senate, the president of the Senate, officially the presiding officer of the Senate, is the vice president of the United States. And so you guys know the vice president of the United States is Mike Pence, and so he therefore has the title the president of the Senate. The president of the Senate gets no vote, except when the Senate is tied. So if there's like a 50-50 vote in the Senate, then the vice president can cast a tie-breaking vote. That happens fairly rarely, but it's actually happened since Mike Pence has been vice president. When Betsy DeVos was nominated as education secretary by President Trump, She was a controversial pick. Not everybody thought she was going to do a great job. And so the vote to confirm her as education secretary actually was a 50-50 vote. And then Mike Pence came to the Senate and voted yes on Betsy DeVos, and so she became the education secretary because Mike Pence cast a tie-breaking vote in her favor. However, as you can imagine, the vice president, as kind of the president's handyman, oftentimes has better things to do than just sit and preside over the Senate. So Mike Pence is not typically seen in the Senate. He usually only comes for a couple of reasons. One, every year for the State of the Union, when everybody comes, and two, to do these tie-breaking votes. The rest of the time, the presiding officer of the Senate is somebody called the President pro tempore, which is basically Latin for the temporary president. By tradition, the President pro tempore of the Senate is the longest-serving member of the majority party. Since Republicans have the majority, who's the longest-serving Republican in the Senate today? Chuck Grassley is a Republican from Iowa. The person, though, who really actually controls the Senate, who has the power to get things done in the Senate, is the majority leader. And since 2015, the majority leader of the Senate has been Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is a Republican from Kentucky, the kind of turtle-looking fellow there. And he is also a very powerful person as he controls the Senate. And again, he is kind of the guy who is able to control what the Senate does. He doesn't have as much power as the Speaker of the House does because, again, senators have more independence from their leadership. But Mitch McConnell is also a brilliant politician and has been able to use his influence to keep his Republican caucus largely in line since he's been their leader. And also, like we have in the House, in the Senate, there are whips. And so the majority whip is John Thune, Republican from South Carolina. And then finally, the Democrats, because they are in the minority and they don't control the White House, they only get these two guys. They have their minority leader, Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York. So he's the one who basically tries to control the Democratic minority in the Senate. And then the minority whip is Dick Durbin, who is a senator from Illinois. And I think, we'll talk about gerrymandering tomorrow. So that's basically your introduction to the legislature. You don't necessarily need to know who all these guys are, but I'd ask that you would remember the Speaker of the House and Minority Leader in the House, so Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. And then please remember the Majority Leader and Minority Leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. Those are going to be important. The rest are kind of just fun, but those ones are names that you should be familiar with. You should remember your two senators, Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters, and your congressman, Justin Amash. So these should be all names that when you hear them in conversation, you're like, oh yeah, that's this guy. You need to remember about just kind of especially the part where the Senate is the one who confirms the president's appointees and ratifies treaties. I think that's an important thing to know. Remember the 2 senators for every state, 100 senators. Remember that the House is divided by population. Remember that House members serve 2-year terms. The Senate serves 6-year terms. And, of course, please remember that there are 2 legislatures that apply to you. Congress, which we've been talking about in Washington, D.C., and then the Michigan legislature in Lansing, which also has a Senate and a House of Representatives, but it's different. All right, that concludes your introduction to the legislature. I hope you enjoyed that and learned a lot, and I will be with you tomorrow. Take care.